There's a version of financial success that looks exactly the way you'd expect. The spreadsheets, the frugality, the visible sacrifice, the person who talks constantly about their portfolio, who announces every financial decision like it's a public commitment device, who wears their discipline as a kind of identity. And then there's the version research keeps finding, the quieter one, the one that doesn't look like anything from the outside and doesn't feel particularly virtuous from the inside either. Behavioral economists at the University of Chicago Booth School have found that the strongest predictors of long-term wealth accumulation aren't income, financial literacy, or willpower. They're behavioral pattern, automated, largely invisible, and often mistaken for personality quirks rather than financial assets. The people who build serious wealth over time aren't grinding through superior self-control every single day. They've structured their lives so that fewer decisions are required, so that the right behavior happens on its own, and so that the gap between what they earn and what they spend stays open almost by default. Stay with me, because what follows is going to reframe what you think you're missing. Some of what you've been calling your flaws might actually be working for you, and some of what you've been told is responsible might be costing you more than you realize. Before we get into the specific habits, there's one concept worth understanding because it quietly underlies all 10 of them. Researchers call it delayed discounting, the degree to which your brain devalues future rewards compared to present ones. Every human brain does this. $1 available right now feels worth more than $1 available in 10 years, even after accounting for interest. The difference between people isn't that some brains do this and some don't. It's the degree. Some brains discount the future steeply, making present rewards feel overwhelmingly more real than distant ones. Other brains have a flatter curve. Future money, future security, future consequences feel almost as immediate as today's. The 10 habits that follow either come naturally to people with flatter curves, or they're structural workarounds that produce the same outcomes for people whose brains are wired differently. Neither is superior, both are workable. That's the whole point. The first quiet habit is this. They make financial decisions slowly, and they feel no urgency to decide faster. Here's something that sounds like a flaw until you understand what's actually happening. When someone takes a long time to commit to a purchase, sitting with it for days, circling back, never feeling pushed toward a close, the surrounding culture tends to read that as hesitancy, indecision, or anxiety. But research examining decision pacing and financial outcomes points to something quite different. People who create deliberate delay before financial decisions make measurably fewer regretted purchases and carry less revolving debt over time. Not because they're running elaborate cost-benefit analyses in their heads, because they've unconsciously figured out something the research confirms. Psychologists refer to this as the hot-cold empathy gap, a concept developed extensively at Carnegie Mellon. When you're in a hot emotional state, excited by an opportunity, anxious about scarcity, or simply in the sensory environment of a store or a well-designed product page, your brain dramatically underestimates how differently you'll feel once that emotional state passes. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term planning and rational evaluation, yields ground to the limbic system, which is responding to now. The pause that slow deciders create isn't indecision. It's a neurological circuit breaker. It buys time for the prefrontal cortex to re-engage after the emotional spike has softened. What this feels like from the inside is a genuine absence of urgency, not anxiety about making the wrong choice, just a lack of compulsion to close the decision immediately. From the outside, that can look like someone who never seems excited enough about anything to just commit, and there is a real cost to it. In social situations, splitting a spontaneous dinner, going in on something with a group, making a quick joint decision, this pattern creates friction. The person with this habit may come across as unenthusiastic or difficult to coordinate with. That's not a small thing. Your brain in a heated moment of opportunity or excitement literally cannot accurately predict how your calmer self will feel about that same decision an hour or a week later. The delay isn't procrastination. It's one of the cheapest financial tools available. The second habit is one that seems like it couldn't possibly be right. People with this pattern barely think about money. Not because they're careless, because they've automated their financial lives to the point where money becomes almost invisible. Here's the thing about people who've built serious wealth quietly. They're often the least preoccupied with money day to day. Research from Cornell University found that people who automate their savings and recurring financial obligations experience significantly lower financial stress and accumulate more over equivalent time periods than those who manage the same decisions manually. The systems are running, the contribution goes out on payday, the payment process is on schedule, there's nothing to decide, so there's nothing to deplete. This connects to a well-documented phenomenon called decision fatigue, the finding that the quality of human decision-making degrades as the number of decisions made in a given period increases. This isn't a character weakness. It's a structural feature of executive function documented extensively in research associated with Roy Baumeister and replicated across many contexts. Every micro decision about money. Do I really need this? Can I afford a small treat today? Should I adjust my savings rate this month? Draws from the same finite cognitive resource as every other decision you make. People who have built robust financial automation aren't more disciplined. They've removed the questions. The prefrontal cortex doesn't get depleted by decisions it never has to answer. What this looks like from the outside is someone who seems oddly unbothered by money. Not reckless, just calm. The practical implication is straightforward. Automatic transfers on payday before you see the money hit your spending account, preset investment contributions, automated bills. The goal isn't indifference to your finances, it's making the important behavior structural rather than volitional, so it doesn't compete with everything else your brain is doing on a given Tuesday. The hidden catch is that fully automated systems require periodic review. Drift happens, subscriptions accumulate, financial goals shift, life circumstances change. Set it and forget it works best with a quarterly check-in that catches what the automation misses. The third pattern is subtler and often goes unrecognized for what it is. People with this habit feel genuinely uncomfortable when their spending starts to approach their income, even when they can objectively afford the spending, even when no financial rule is being broken. Research from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that individuals who maintain consistent gaps between their income and their spending, regardless of how high their income climbs, accumulate wealth at rates that far outpace their peers. The gap itself is the variable, not the income level, not the financial knowledge. The gap. Here's the neuroscience underneath that. When income rises, the brain updates its reference point. What felt like abundance at one income level becomes the baseline at the next. Researchers call this hedonic adaptation, the brain's tendency to normalize new conditions and return to a stable emotional set point over time. It's why a raise feels exciting for a few weeks and then just feels like normal. It's why the upgraded apartment that thrilled you in month 1 is just where you live by month 6. This is not a failure of gratitude, it's how brains manage the continuous stream of new information. Lifestyle inflation, spending rising to meet income almost automatically, isn't a lapse in discipline. It's the hedonic treadmill doing exactly what it's designed to do. People who resist this pattern aren't fighting the treadmill harder. Their internal anchor point simply hasn't shifted. Their brain categorizes the income increase as buffer rather than budget. Spending up to the new income level doesn't feel like reward. It feels wrong, like something is misaligned. That's not virtue. It's a psychological set point that happens to produce financial outcomes. Your brain updates its reference point every time circumstances change. That's not a weakness. It's adaptation. But it does mean the people who keep the gap open aren't necessarily more virtuous. They're just wired, or have trained themselves to anchor differently. The real cost of this pattern is that it can make it genuinely difficult to enjoy money, even when enjoying it is completely appropriate. A meaningful raise doesn't feel like permission. A financial milestone lands and then immediately recedes. The discomfort that protects against overspending can, unchecked, prevent real celebration or investment in present-day quality of life. That's worth naming. The fourth habit is where the neuroscience gets uncomfortably honest about how much of our spending isn't actually about what we're buying. But here's what nobody talks about when it comes to spending behavior. A significant portion of discretionary purchases aren't driven by desire for the thing being purchased. They're driven by the need to change an emotional state. Boredom, stress, loneliness, mild anxiety looking for somewhere to land. Research from the University of Central Lancashire on boredom and consumption found that boredom is one of the most consistently underestimated drivers of discretionary spending, precisely because it doesn't feel like emotional spending. It feels like preference. It feels like wanting something. The psychology behind emotional shopping is this: boredom is neurologically uncomfortable. It's associated with a measurable dip in dopaminergic activity, a reduction in the brain's reward signaling that registers as a low-grade need for stimulation. Your brain interprets that signal as a directive: go find something rewarding. And retail environments, physical or digital, are among the most efficiently designed stimulation delivery systems in existence. They're built specifically to activate the wanting circuitry. People who have broken the boredom to spending connection didn't do it through willpower. They recognized at some point that shopping had been functioning as an emotional regulation tool, often invisibly, often automatically. And they built a different route to the same regulation. What's striking about people with this habit is that they're not less susceptible to boredom or to the discomfort of it. They've just developed a different response to the signal. And for a lot of people, building that different response involves a genuinely uncomfortable period of sitting with the restlessness without rooting it toward a purchase. The practical shift isn't don't shop when bored. It's noticing in real time that the pull toward browsing or buying is happening at a moment when boredom or emotional discomfort is present, and recognizing that as a mechanism, not the preference. Awareness alone begins to interrupt the automatic route. Your brain isn't weak for finding retail stimulating. That's a feature of the environment, not a flaw in you. The fifth habit is one that psychologists find genuinely unusual because it describes something most people's brains simply don't do by default. People with this habit have a vivid, specific, almost uncomfortable relationship with their future self. When they think about who they'll be in 30 years, that person doesn't feel abstract. They have a face, preferences, constraints, and a voice in present-day decisions. Research from Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab, through work led by Hal Hirschfield, found that when people have high psychological continuity between their present and future selves, when the future self feels real rather than distant, their financial decision-making changes in measurable ways. They treat future needs as present obligations rather than theoretical considerations. The future self has legitimate standing in current choices. The neuroimaging component of this research is worth sitting with. When most people think about their future selves, their brains activate regions associated with thinking about strangers, other people, not themselves. The future self is neurologically foreign to most of us, and spending money intended for a stranger is easy. You don't feel the loss the same way. But when the future self feels specific and real, when you can actually picture that person and care what they think, the calculation changes completely. You're not failing your future self by living now. This habit doesn't require you to sacrifice the present entirely, but it does mean that for people who have this pattern, decisions that compromise future security feel less like trade-offs and more like a betrayal of someone they already know. The hidden cost is real. A very strong future self-connection can create difficulty with presence. The person who inhabits their future self vividly may struggle to fully inhabit the current one. Experiences become previews. Present joy can feel conditional on future security being locked in first. That's worth acknowledging as a genuine trade-off, not a small footnote. The sixth habit is one that most financial content will never say out loud, because naming it honestly requires admitting something uncomfortable about how emotional regulation and spending are connected. And here's the thing: most financial content skips. Boredom isn't the only emotional state that routes to spending. So does low-level stress, ambient dissatisfaction, the particular restlessness that comes from too much unstructured time. People who spend less on average aren't less susceptible to those states, but they use boredom differently. Specifically, they've learned to treat boredom as data, as a signal that something else is needed, not a problem that spending can solve. This connects to research on how structured routines affect decision-making. Studies from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School on Decision Architecture found that people with more structured daily patterns make fewer impulsive decisions across categories, including spending. When your time has a shape, you're less likely to be in an unstructured moment of ambient restlessness looking for stimulation. The routine isn't restrictive, it's protective, not from excitement, but from the reactive spending that fills unstructured time by default. The psychology behind this habit is simpler than it sounds. A boring, consistent baseline makes discretionary decisions deliberate rather than default. Adventures get planned. Treats get chosen intentionally. The spending that happens isn't absent. It's just not filling a vacuum. And the brain that isn't constantly toggling between stimulation seeking and depletion has more executive function left over for the decisions that actually matter. People who live this way aren't less interesting. They're less exposed to the particular financial drain of reactive, unplanned spending that happens when days don't have enough structure to prevent the brain from going looking for novelty on its own. The seventh habit is one that looks like confidence, but is actually something more specific and more learnable. But here's what nobody tells you about how wealthy people measure themselves. They're almost never measuring themselves against other people. Not because they've transcended ego or don't care about status, but because they've replaced the reference class. Research from Princeton and the University of Michigan on relative income and life satisfaction has consistently found that individuals who evaluate their financial progress against their own prior trajectory, am I closer to my goals than I was last year? Rather than against peer comparison, am I keeping pace with what people around me are spending? Accumulate wealth faster and report higher financial satisfaction regardless of their absolute wealth level. Social comparison theory, originally developed by Leon Festinger, describes comparison as a default cognitive function, not vanity, not weakness, just how brains calibrate enough. Your brain uses other people as reference points because without them, it has no baseline for what normal looks like. That's not a flaw. It's information processing. The problem is that in environments saturated with visible consumption, social feeds, neighborhoods, peer groups, the reference class your brain is handed by default is built for spending, not saving. It's calibrated to show you what people are acquiring, not what they're building. People with this habit haven't turned off social comparison, they've shifted the scoreboard. They're tracking movement toward their own targets, and that internal measure doesn't require them to upgrade anything to stay competitive. The cost is real though. An entirely internal reference class can make it genuinely hard to know when you've done enough. Without any external benchmark, the goalpost can move indefinitely inward. The discipline that prevents lifestyle inflation can, in its extreme form, prevent knowing when security has already been achieved. The eighth pattern is one where the neuroscience gets striking in a way that changes how you understand financial behavior at a fundamental level. Here's where it gets neurologically interesting. Many people with strong long-term financial habits describe debt not as a financial concept, but as a physical experience, something heavy, a background noise that makes it hard to rest. This isn't metaphor, and it's not anxiety disorder. Research on the pain of paying, a concept developed extensively by Dracian Preiler at MIT, documents that spending money activates neural regions associated with discomfort in most people to some degree. But for a measurable subset, carrying debt produces a sustained version of that activation. Not just at the moment of payment, but as ongoing background neural signaling for as long as the debt exists. Their nervous system registers owing money as a low-level threat state. That's not a rational calculation about interest rates. It's a physiological response. Your brain in a high debt sensitivity state isn't making a nuanced financial judgment. It's experiencing something closer to discomfort the way you'd experience a persistent physical irritation, present, distracting, motivating. The result is an almost unconscious drive toward debt elimination that doesn't require discipline because it's running on something more immediate than willpower. From the outside, this person pays down debt aggressively, even when the math might argue for investing the difference. From the inside, carrying the debt just feels wrong in a way that's hard to explain rationally. But here's what nobody tells you about this sensitivity. It can make it genuinely difficult to use debt strategically. A mortgage on an appreciating property, a business loan at a rate below the return it enables, borrowed capital deployed at a spread. These are cases where debt creates net positive outcomes. A nervous system that treats all debt as uniformly threatening can push people to suboptimal decisions at the stage of wealth building where leverage would actually serve them. The sensitivity that keeps consumer debt at zero can also prevent moves that require a higher tolerance for calculated risk. The ninth pattern is the one that tends to reframe the whole list. Research from the University of Pennsylvania, examining reward center activation during financial decision-making, found that a measurable subset of people show heightened activity in the brain's reward circuitry when they observe their account balances growing, even by small amounts. The dopamine response that most people associate with acquisition and purchase is, for these individuals, firing at accumulation instead. The psychology behind savings as a reward is this. For most brains, the pleasure of anticipation and the pleasure of the new thing peak at the transaction, the moment of getting. That's normal brain chemistry, and it's adaptive. But for people whose reward system responds to growth rather than acquisition, compound interest isn't a concept. It's something their nervous system tracks and responds to with something functionally resembling satisfaction. They check their balances the way other people check social feeds, not from anxiety, but from something closer to pleasure. This isn't superior wiring, it's different wiring that happens to align with long-term wealth building. And understanding that it's neurological, not moral, changes something important about how we should think about people who don't have it. If watching your balance grow doesn't feel exciting, you're not missing a character trait. Your brain routes the reward differently. Gamification tools, visual savings trackers, net worth spreadsheets, milestone-based celebrations, these are functional attempts to create externally the same reward signal that other brains generate internally. They work not because they're gimmicks, but because they're meeting a real neurological need with a deliberate structure. You're not engineering weakness, you're engineering around a difference. The 10th and final pattern is the one that reveals what this whole list is actually costing. And here's the one that nobody wants to say plainly, but the research documents clearly. People with strong long-term money habits often feel guilty spending on themselves, even when they can objectively afford it, even when they've hit their goals, even when the purchase is entirely reasonable by any external standard. A study published in the Journal of Economic Psychology found that individuals with high savings rates report higher rates of guilt around discretionary spending than those who save less, even when their objective financial situation is objectively more secure. The internal voice that spent years preventing overspending doesn't automatically quiet when the circumstances that required it have changed. The psychology of spending guilt is this. The brain's threat response systems, once trained to associate discretionary spending with a risk or failure, don't deactivate cleanly when the threat resolves. Conditioned emotional responses persist past their original trigger context. The person who built financial security through years of vigilant spending restraint has trained their nervous system to flag discretionary purchases as danger. That training doesn't switch off at a certain balance. It requires active, deliberate counter-conditioning, not more discipline, but something closer to permission, repeated consciously until the nervous system updates its model. Your brain running a spending guilt response isn't broken or ungrateful. It's running a protection system that hasn't received the memo that the threat has changed. That's not a flaw. But it is worth recognizing because the system that served you during the building phase can become the thing that prevents you from experiencing what you built. You're not ungrateful for not feeling secure even when you are. The vigilance that builds wealth can prevent ever feeling that the wealth is enough. That's the most important trade-off on this list, and it's the one most rarely acknowledged in any honest conversation about financial success. Now let's step back and look at all 10 of these together. Because when you do, they don't all look like advantages. Several of them look like anxiety. Several of them look like difficulty enjoying the present. One of them looks a lot like an inability to feel satisfied no matter how well things are going. That's because they are, at least in part. This list wasn't describing virtues. It was describing a particular psychological and neurological profile that produces financial outcomes our society rewards, while simultaneously producing costs our society almost never discusses. The person with most of these habits may be financially secure and quietly miserable about money at the same time. That's not a contradiction. It's a pattern the research documents clearly. The person who doesn't have these habits, who spends freely, lives presently, treats the future as a vague and not particularly threatening place, is not undisciplined. Research on income and well-being, including well-known work examining the relationship between wealth and day-to-day life satisfaction, consistently finds that beyond a certain threshold of financial security, additional accumulation doesn't produce proportional increases in experience well-being. The person living fully in the present may be optimizing for something the wealth-building profile misses entirely. They're probably less anxious on an average Tuesday. That counts for something. Here's the thing that cuts through all of it. The baseline tendency toward delay discounting, how steeply your brain discounts future rewards, is largely neurological. It's not a character assessment, it's a description of equipment. If you struggle with saving, you're not failing at discipline. You're working with a brain that weights the present more heavily, and that is information, not indictment. You can build structural systems, automation, visual tracking, future self-exercises, commitment devices that produce the same financial outcomes without requiring you to rewire the neurology. The architecture can compensate for the wiring. That's what most of these habits, at their core, are doing. And if you do recognize yourself across this list, if you see your own spending hesitation, your own discomfort with debt, your own guilt about treating yourself, you're probably going to be financially secure, but also check in. Are you experiencing that security? Or are the same systems that protected you now protecting you from your own life? The goal was never to build something you couldn't inhabit. Give yourself permission to let the present count too. If something in this list made you feel seen, either because you recognized your own patterns or because you finally have a language for why someone in your life thinks about money the way they do, drop a comment and tell me which one landed. And if this is the kind of content you want more of, subscribe. Because understanding your own brain isn't about judgment. It's the only starting point that actually changes anything. This channel is created for educational and informational purposes only. It is not intended to replace professional psychological, medical, financial, or therapeutic advice. Always consult with a professional.